We fell in love, Richard corrected. Michael, I know how this looks. I know it seems like I took advantage of a vulnerable woman, like I betrayed my best friend for sex. But it wasn't like that. Linda and I had been friends for years. We'd been through hell together, watching David destroy himself and everyone around him. What happened between us was about finding comfort and safety with someone who understood. Did my father suspect? He suspected something, Richard said. He'd always been jealous and paranoid, but it got worse in the months before he died. He started questioning Linda about every phone call, every errand, every minute she spent away from the house. He hired that private investigator not because he had evidence of an affair, but because he was convinced Linda was plotting against him somehow. And when he got the proof? Richard's face darkened. When he got the proof, he didn't react the way you'd expect a betrayed husband to react. He wasn't heartbroken or devastated. He was triumphant. He finally had the leverage he needed to control Linda completely. The letter Linda showed me was just the beginning, Richard said. David called me the night before he died. He told me about the photos, about his plans to use them to destroy both of us. He said he was going to ruin my business, destroy my reputation, make sure I could never work in construction again, and he was going to keep Linda trapped in their marriage forever, using the threat of exposing our affair to ensure her compliance. What did you say to him? I told him I loved her, Richard said simply. I told him that if he really loved her, he would let her go. I told him that what he was doing to her was destroying her and that she deserved better. How did he react? He laughed, Richard said, and there was pain in his voice. He said Linda belonged to him, that she would always belong to him, and that I was a fool if I thought I could take her away from him. And the next morning, he was dead. The next morning, he was dead, Richard confirmed. Linda called me, hysterical, saying that David had confronted her with the photos and they'd had a terrible fight. She said he'd grabbed her, shaken her, told her she would never escape him. And then he just collapsed. We sat in silence for a moment, both of us processing the tragedy of it all. My father had died not from the pain of betrayal, but from the rage of losing control over the woman he'd been abusing. Do you think he would have followed through on his threats? I asked. Absolutely, Richard said without hesitation. David was capable of incredible vindictiveness when he felt wronged. He would have destroyed both of us without a second thought. So in a way, his death freed you both. Richard looked uncomfortable with that assessment. I would never say I'm glad David died. Despite everything he became, he was my friend for 20 years. But yes, his death freed Linda from a situation that was killing her slowly. What happens now? I asked. Between you and Linda? I don't know, Richard said honestly. Linda needs time to heal, to figure out who she is when she's not living in fear. And I need to figure out how to live with the guilt of what happened. What guilt? The guilt of falling in love with my best friend's wife, Richard said. The guilt of not doing more to help Linda sooner. The guilt of being relieved that David is gone. Richard, I said, leaning forward, you saved Linda's life. If you hadn't been there for her, if you hadn't given her a reason to hope for something better, she might not have survived what my father was doing to her. Or she might have found the courage to leave him sooner if I hadn't been enabling her to stay by providing an escape, Richard said. I'll never know if I helped her or hurt her. You helped her, I said firmly, and for what it's worth, I'm sorry for threatening to destroy you. I didn't know the truth about what was happening. You were protecting your father's memory, Richard said. I understand that. David was a good father to you, Michael. Whatever else he was, he loved you genuinely. I'm starting to understand that people can be both good and bad at the same time, I said. My father was a loving parent and an abusive husband. You were a loyal friend and a man having an affair with his friend's wife. Linda was a faithful wife for years, and then an unfaithful one when she needed to survive. Life is complicated, Richard agreed. People are complicated. What are you going to do about the business? I asked. I'm selling my shares to Linda, Richard said. She's going to be a silent partner, and I'm going to run the day-to-day operations. It seems like the best way to honor David's legacy while ensuring that Linda is financially secure. That's generous of you. It's the least I can do, Richard said. Linda deserves to benefit from the company David built, especially considering what she endured to help him build it. As we prepared to leave the coffee shop, Richard stopped me with a question. Michael, do you think you can ever forgive me? For the affair? For betraying David? For all of it? I thought about it. 3 months ago, I would have said never. But now, knowing the full story, understanding the complexity of the situation, I realized that forgiveness wasn't about condoning what Richard had done. It was about accepting that sometimes people make imperfect choices in impossible situations. I forgive you, I said. And I think eventually my father would have forgiven you too. The man he was before the drinking and the violence took over. That man would have wanted Linda to be happy and safe. Richard's eyes filled with tears. Thank you, he said. That means more to me than you know. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on how much my understanding of my family had changed. In just a few months, I'd gone from seeing my father as a perfect man betrayed by his wife to understanding him as a flawed human being who had let his demons destroy the people he claimed to love. I'd gone from seeing Linda as a gold-digging cheater to recognizing her as a survivor who had found love and hope in the darkest period of her life. I'd gone from seeing Richard as a backstabbing friend to understanding him as a man who had tried to save someone he loved, even when it meant betraying someone he'd considered a brother. None of it was simple. None of it was the clear-cut story of good versus evil that I'd initially believed. But maybe that was the point. Maybe real life, real relationships, real love and loss and betrayal and forgiveness were always more complicated than the stories we tell ourselves. My father was gone, and I would always mourn the man he had been at his best. But I could also acknowledge the man he had been at his worst, and I could choose to support the people who had survived his darkness. Linda and Richard deserved a chance at happiness together. They deserved to build something beautiful from the ashes of something that had been destroying them both. And I deserved to move forward with a more complete understanding of the people I loved, accepting their flaws along with their virtues. The war I'd thought I was fighting had turned out to be something else entirely. And in the end, the only victory that mattered was the victory of truth, understanding, and forgiveness. No, I said. I'm not going to challenge anything. You deserve whatever Dad left you. You earned it by surviving what he put you through. Linda started crying again, but this time it was relief rather than grief. Thank you, she said. Thank you for listening. Thank you for believing me. What about you and Richard? I asked. I don't know, Linda said honestly. We love each other, but our relationship started under such terrible circumstances. I need time to heal, to figure out who I am when I'm not afraid all the time. As I prepared to leave, Linda stopped me at the door. Michael, she said, I want you to know that despite everything that happened between your father and me, you were always the best part of my life. You were the son I never had, and I love you. I love you too, I said, and I meant it. And Linda, if you need anything at all, you call me. We're still family. As I drove away from the house, I realized that my father's death had taught me something important about the complexity of human nature. People aren't simply good or evil. They're complicated, flawed, capable of both love and cruelty. My father had loved me genuinely while abusing his wife. Linda had been unfaithful while trying to survive domestic violence. Richard had betrayed his business partner while trying to save a woman from abuse. None of it was simple. None of it was black and white. But one thing was clear. Linda deserved to be free, to be safe, to be happy. And if that meant being with Richard, then I would support that choice. My war against Linda and Richard was over before it had really begun. Because sometimes, learning the truth changes everything. 3 months after my father's funeral, I was sitting in a coffee shop in downtown Springfield, waiting for Richard to arrive. It was the first time we'd spoken since our confrontation, at his office, and I wasn't sure what to expect. Linda had asked me to meet with him, saying that there were things he wanted to tell me about my father that might help me understand the full picture of what had been happening in the years before his death. When Richard walked in, he looked like he'd aged a decade in 3 months. His usually perfect hair was disheveled. There were dark circles under his eyes, and he moved like a man carrying an enormous weight on his shoulders. "Michael," he said, sitting down across from me. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I wasn't sure you would. Linda asked me to," I said. "She said you had things to tell me about my father." Richard nodded, ordering a black coffee from the waitress before turning back to me. "I need you to know that your father was my best friend for 20 years. What happened between Linda and me, it wasn't something I planned or wanted. It just happened because I couldn't stand to watch him destroy her anymore." "Linda told me about the abuse," I said. "She showed me the medical records, the police reports, the photographs." "Then you know that the man you thought you knew wasn't the whole story," Richard said. "Michael, I tried to help your father. I tried to get him into therapy, into AA, into anger management. But he refused to admit he had a problem." "When did it start?" I asked. "The drinking? The violence?" "About 5 years ago," Richard said. "It was gradual at first. He'd have a few too many drinks at business dinners, get a little aggressive with contractors who weren't meeting deadlines. But it escalated after you graduated college and moved to Chicago." "Why then?" "Because he felt like he was losing control of everything," Richard explained. "The construction industry was getting more competitive. Younger companies were underbidding us on projects, and his son was building a life that didn't include him. David was a man who needed to feel in control, and when that control started slipping away, he turned to alcohol. And Linda became his target." "Linda became his outlet," Richard corrected. "When he couldn't control the business or control you, he took it out on her. She was the one person in his life who couldn't fight back, who couldn't leave." The waitress brought Richard's coffee, and he wrapped his hands around the mug like he was trying to warm himself. "I should have done something sooner," Richard said. "I should have called the police, should have forced Linda to press charges, should have confronted David directly. But I was a coward. I was afraid of losing the business, afraid of destroying our friendship, afraid of making things worse for Linda." "When did you first realize you had feelings for her?" Richard was quiet for a long moment. 2 years ago, when David put her in the hospital with that broken wrist. I went to visit her, and she broke down crying, telling me how scared she was, how trapped she felt. I held her while she cried, and I realized that I'd been in love with her for years without admitting it to myself. "But you didn't act on it then?" "No," Richard said. "I tried to convince her to leave David, offered to help her financially, told her she could stay at my house until she got back on her feet. But she was too afraid. She said David would kill her if she tried to leave." "So when did the affair actually start?" 6 months ago," Richard said. "David had beaten her again, worse than usual. She called me in the middle of the night, and I went to get her. She stayed at my house for 3 days while David was out of town on business, and during those 3 days, we fell into each other." "You fell into bed together," I said bluntly. When I arrived at the house that evening, Linda was waiting for me in the living room with a glass of wine in her hand and a stack of papers on the coffee table. She looked older than I'd ever seen her, like the stress of the past week had aged, her years in just a few days. "Thank you for coming," she said as I sat down across from her. "I know you hate me right now, and I understand why. But there are things about your father, about our marriage, that you don't know." "I know enough," I said. "I know you were cheating on him with his best friend for months. I know he found out, and it probably killed him. What else is there to—" "No," Linda took a shaky breath. "Your father wasn't the man you think he was, Michael." "Don't," I said sharply. "Don't you dare try to rewrite history to make yourself look better. My father was a good man who loved you, and you betrayed him." "He was a good man," Linda agreed. "But he wasn't a good husband. Not to me." She reached for the stack of papers on the coffee table and handed me a document. It was a medical report from a hospital in Chicago, dated 3 years ago. "What is this?" I asked. "Read it," Linda said quietly. I scanned the document, and my blood went cold. It was an emergency room report for Linda Thompson, detailing treatment for a broken wrist, bruised ribs, and facial contusions. The cause of injury was listed as domestic violence. "This is fake," I said, but my voice sounded uncertain even to me. "It's not fake," Linda said. "Your father put me in the hospital 3 years ago during one of his rages. I told everyone I fell down the stairs." I stared at the document, trying to process what I was seeing. "My father never hit you. He would never hurt anyone." "He never hit you," Linda corrected. "But Michael, you moved out when you were 18. You didn't see what happened in this house after you left." She handed me another document, a police report from 2 years ago. Linda had called 911 reporting domestic violence, but the report noted that she had declined to press charges and claimed it was a misunderstanding. "I don't believe this," I said, but the evidence was right there in front of me. "Your father had a drinking problem," Linda said. "It got worse after you graduated college and moved to Chicago. He felt like he was losing control of everything. The business was struggling, you were building your own life, and he was getting older. He started drinking heavily, and when he drank, he became violent." "You're lying," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. Linda pulled up her sleeves, revealing faded scars on her arms. "These are from when he grabbed me and threw me against the kitchen counter 2 years ago. And this," she lifted her hair to show a small scar near her hairline, "is from when he hit me with a coffee mug." I felt like the world was tilting sideways. "Why didn't you leave him? Why didn't you tell someone?" "Because I loved him," Linda said, tears streaming down her face. "Because when he wasn't drinking, he was the man I married. Because he always apologized afterward, always promised it would never happen again. And because I was afraid of what he might do if I tried to leave." "This doesn't justify having an affair," I said weakly. "No, it doesn't," Linda agreed. "But, Michael, I was so lonely, so scared, so desperate for someone to treat me with kindness. When Richard started paying attention to me, when he made me feel valued and safe, I fell for him." "Richard knew about the abuse?" Linda nodded. "He saw the bruises. He was the one who convinced me to go to the hospital that first time. He wanted me to leave David, but I was too afraid." I sat there in stunned silence, trying to reconcile this version of my father with the man I'd known and loved. The David Thompson Linda was describing was a stranger to me. "Show me more proof," I said finally. Linda went upstairs and returned with a shoebox full of photographs. They showed her with various injuries over the years. Black eyes that she'd covered with makeup, bruises on her arms and neck, cuts and scrapes that she'd explained away as accidents. "I documented everything," Linda said. "I kept thinking that someday I might need proof, that someday I might find the courage to leave him." "Why didn't you?" I asked. "Because he threatened to kill me if I ever tried," Linda said simply. "And he threatened to destroy Richard's business to ruin his reputation. David had connections throughout the construction industry. He could have made sure Richard never worked again." I looked through the photographs, each one more damning than the last. There were dozens of them, spanning years, showing a pattern of abuse that I'd been completely blind to. "The private investigator," I said suddenly. "Dad hired him to follow you, not because he suspected an affair, but because he was monitoring your movements." "Exactly," Linda said. "He was tracking everywhere I went, everyone I talked to. He was becoming increasingly paranoid and controlling. The affair with Richard was the only time I felt free, the only time I felt safe." "But the investigator's report said Dad wanted to pursue divorce proceedings." Linda's face darkened. "He wasn't planning to divorce me, Michael. He was planning to use the evidence of my affair to threaten me, to make sure I could never leave him, never expose what he'd been doing to me." She handed me another document, a handwritten letter in my father's writing. "I found this in his desk after he died," Linda said. "Read it." The letter was addressed to Linda, and as I read it, I felt sick to my stomach. "Linda, I know about you and Richard. I have proof. Photos, hotel records, everything. If you ever try to leave me, if you ever try to expose our private business, I will destroy both of you. Richard will lose his business, his reputation, his family, and you will lose everything. You belong to me, and you always will. We're going to have a conversation about your future behavior, and you're going to listen very carefully to what I have to say. David. He was going to blackmail you, I said, my voice barely a whisper. He was going to trap me forever, Linda said. Michael, your father didn't die from the stress of discovering my affair. He died from the stress of planning how to use it against me. I sat there holding the letter, trying to process this complete reversal of everything I thought I knew. My father hadn't been the victim, he'd been the abuser. Linda hadn't been the villain, she'd been the victim trying to escape. The heart attack, I said. What really happened that morning? Linda's face went pale. We had a fight. He confronted me with the photos, told me about his plans to use them against me. I told him I was leaving him anyway, that I didn't care what he did to Richard or to me. I said I'd rather lose everything than spend another day being afraid of him. And then? He flew into a rage, Linda said. He grabbed me, started shaking me, screaming that I would never leave him. And then he just collapsed. The anger, the adrenaline, the stress of losing control. It was too much for his heart. I looked at Linda's neck and saw faint bruises that I'd assumed were from grief and stress. Now I realized they were from my father's hands. Why didn't you tell me this before? I asked. Because I knew you'd never believe me, Linda said. You idolized your father. You saw him as this perfect man who could do no wrong. How could I tell you that he'd been abusing me for years? You could have shown me the evidence. Could I? Linda asked. Michael, you were ready to destroy me based on a few photographs of me with Richard. If I'd told you your father was abusive, would you have believed me? Or would you have assumed I was lying to cover up my affair? I knew she was right. I would never have believed her. I would have dismissed her claims as the desperate lies of a cheating wife trying to justify her betrayal. Richard, I said. Does he know all this? He's known from the beginning, Linda said. He's been trying to get me to leave David for 2 years. The affair, it started because I needed someone to make me feel human again. Someone who treated me with kindness instead of violence. I sat there in my father's house, surrounded by evidence that the man I'd loved and admired had been a monster. Every memory I had of him was now tainted by the knowledge of what he'd been doing to Linda when I wasn't around. I'm sorry, I said finally. I'm so sorry I didn't know. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you. You were his son, Linda said gently. He would never have let you see that side of him. And Michael, despite everything he did to me, he did love you. He was proud of you. The man you knew was real. He just wasn't the only version of him that existed. What happens now? I asked. I don't know, Linda said. You were planning to challenge the will, to sue Richard, to destroy both of us. Are you still going to do that? I thought about it. Everything I'd believed about the situation had been wrong. Linda wasn't a gold-digging cheater who had killed my father with her betrayal. She was an abuse victim who had found love and safety with someone else, and my father had died trying to trap her in a nightmare marriage. The attorney I hired was named Patricia Williams, a sharp woman in her 50s who specialized in estate disputes and had a reputation for taking on cases that other lawyers considered unwinnable. When I showed her the private investigator's report and explained the circumstances of my father's death, her eyes lit up with the kind of predatory interest that told me I'd found the right person for the job. This is fascinating, Patricia said, studying the photographs of Linda and Richard. Your stepmother was having an affair. Your father discovered it just days before his death, and now she stands to inherit everything. There are definitely grounds here to challenge the will. What kind of grounds? I asked. Several possibilities, Patricia said. We could argue undue influence, that Linda manipulated your father into leaving her everything while she was betraying him. We could argue fraud, that she obtained the inheritance under false pretenses by concealing her affair. Or we could argue that the stress of discovering her betrayal directly contributed to your father's death, which would make her ineligible to inherit under the Slayer statute. The Slayer statute? It's a legal principle that prevents someone from benefiting financially from causing another person's death, Patricia explained. If we can prove that Linda's actions directly led to your father's heart attack, She could be barred from inheriting anything. How do we prove that? Medical testimony, expert witnesses, evidence of the timeline between his discovery of the G affair and his death, Patricia said. It won't be easy, but it's possible. What about Richard? Can we go after him too? Patricia smiled grimly. Oh, we can definitely go after Richard. He was your father's business partner, which means he had a fiduciary duty to act in your father's best interests. Having an affair with your father's wife is about as far from that duty as you can get. We can sue him for breach of fiduciary, duty, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and alienation of affection. Alienation of affection? It's an old law, but it's still on the books in Illinois, Patricia said. It allows you to sue someone for deliberately interfering with your family relationship. Richard knew your father was married, knew that having an affair with Linda would destroy your father, and did it anyway. I left Patricia's office feeling energized for the first time since my father's death. Finally, I had a plan. Finally, I could do something to fight back against the people who had betrayed him. But first, I needed to gather more evidence. I spent the next week conducting my own investigation. I talked to employees at Thompson and Blackwood Construction, asking casual questions about Richard's schedule and behavior over the past few months. What I learned painted a picture of a man who had been increasingly distracted and secretive. Mr. Blackwood's been taking a lot of long lunches lately, said Janet, the office manager who had worked for the company for 15 years. And he's been getting a lot of personal phone calls during work hours. Sometimes he'd step outside to take them, like he didn't want anyone to overhear. Did my father notice? I asked. Oh, yes, Janet said. Mr. Thompson asked me about it a few weeks ago. He seemed concerned that Mr. Blackwood wasn't pulling his weight on some of the bigger projects. I also talked to the staff at the Marriott Hotel where Linda and Richard had been meeting. The desk clerk remembered them, particularly because they'd been regular customers for several months. They always paid cash, the clerk told me, and they always requested the same room, 412, on the 4th floor. The woman was very particular about that. How often did they come in? At least once a week, sometimes more, the clerk said. Always during the day, usually Tuesday or Thursday afternoons. I was building a timeline of the affair, documenting every lie Linda had told and every betrayal Richard had committed. But what I really needed was evidence of how my father had reacted to discovering the truth. That evidence came from an unexpected source, my father's cardiologist, Dr. James Morrison. I'm so sorry for your loss, Dr. Morrison said, when I called to ask about my father's final appointment. Your father was a wonderful man, and his death was a shock to all of us. Doctor, I need to ask you something confidential, I said. In the days before my father died, did he seem stressed or upset about anything? Dr. Morrison was quiet for a moment. Michael, I probably shouldn't discuss this, but given the circumstances, yes, your father seemed extremely distressed during his last visit. When was his last visit? October 9th, the day before he died, Dr. Morrison said. He came in complaining of chest pains and asking about stress-related heart problems. He said he'd recently learned something that had turned his world upside down. Did he say what it was? Not specifically, but he mentioned that someone he trusted had betrayed him in the worst possible way, Dr. Morrison said. He was clearly devastated. I recommended that he consider counseling to help him process whatever he was dealing with. What did you tell him about the chest pains? I told him they were likely stress-related, but that he should monitor them carefully and come back immediately if they got worse, Dr. Morrison said. I also told him that severe emotional stress can absolutely trigger cardiac events in people who are predisposed to them. This was exactly what I needed. My father had seen his doctor the day before he died, complaining of stress-related chest pains after discovering Linda's betrayal. Dr. Morrison had warned him that emotional stress could trigger a heart attack. And less than 24 hours later, my father was dead. Armed with this information, I decided it was time to confront Richard. I found him at the construction company on a Thursday afternoon, sitting in his office reviewing blueprints. When he saw me in his doorway, his face went pale. Michael, he said, standing up quickly. I wasn't expecting you. How are you holding up? I've been better, I said, closing the door behind me. We need to talk. Of course, Richard said, but I could see the nervousness in his eyes. What's on your mind? I know about you and Linda, I said simply. Your father was like a brother to me, Richard had said when he came to the house the day after Dad died. If there's anything you or Linda need, anything at all, you just let me know. The morning of the funeral, Linda looked beautiful in a black dress that was elegant but appropriately somber. She'd had her hair done and her makeup was perfect, but not so perfect that it looked like she was trying too hard. She looked like a grieving widow who was doing her best to maintain her composure for the sake of appearances. You look nice, I told her as we prepared to leave for the church. Your father always said I should look my best when representing the family, Linda said. Even today, especially today, I want to make him proud. The church was packed. My father had been well known in the community, both through his business and through his involvement in local charities and civic organizations. I recognized faces from throughout my childhood: teachers, coaches, family friends, business associates, neighbors. Linda and I sat in the front pew, and throughout the service, she held my hand and dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. When Richard gave his eulogy, speaking about my father's integrity, his loyalty, and his dedication to his family, Linda nodded along and smiled through her tears. David Thompson was a man who believed in doing the right thing, no matter how difficult it might be, Richard said from the pulpit. He was a devoted husband, a loving father, and a trusted friend. He leaves behind a legacy of honesty, hard work, and genuine care for others. After the service, we drove to Oakwood Cemetery for the burial. It was a beautiful October day, with golden leaves falling from the trees and a crisp breeze that carried the scent of autumn. Under different circumstances, it would have been the kind of day my father loved. Perfect weather for working outside or taking a long walk. As they lowered my father's casket into the ground, I felt like my world was ending. He had been my anchor, my role model, the person I called when I needed advice or just wanted to talk. The idea of navigating life without him seemed impossible. I was so lost in my grief that I almost didn't notice when Linda stepped away from my side. But when I looked around for her, expecting to find her next to me as we watched my father being laid to rest, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Linda was standing about 20 feet away, near a large oak tree, talking quietly with Richard Blackwood. But they weren't just talking. Linda was smiling, actually smiling, and Richard had his hand on her lower back in a way that seemed far too intimate for a funeral. As I watched in disbelief, Linda laughed softly at something Richard said, then reached up to touch his arm. It was a gesture I'd seen her make with my father countless times. Affectionate, familiar, intimate. The kind of touch that spoke of a relationship that went far beyond friendship or business partnership. I felt like I was going to be sick. My father's body wasn't even in the ground yet, and Linda was flirting with his business partner. The woman who had just hours ago told me we were family, who had held my hand during the funeral service, who had played the role of grieving widow, so convincingly, was acting like a woman who was free to pursue other relationships. Michael? My Aunt Sarah, my father's sister, appeared at my side. Are you okay? You look pale. I couldn't answer. I was still staring at Linda and Richard, watching them interact with a familiarity that suggested this wasn't the first time they'd been this close. Richard said something else and Linda actually giggled, a sound that was completely inappropriate for a cemetery where we'd just buried her husband. Michael, Aunt Sarah said again, following my gaze. Oh my God. She saw it too. The way they were standing together, the way Linda was looking at Richard, the complete absence of grief in her demeanor. This wasn't a widow seeking comfort from a family friend. This was a woman who was already moving on. How long do you think? Aunt Sarah started, then stopped herself. But I knew what she was asking. How long had this been going on? How long? Had Linda been having an affair with Richard while married to my father? How long had I been living in a house with a woman who was betraying the man who loved her? As if sensing that she was being watched, Linda looked in my direction. For just a moment, our eyes met across the cemetery, and I saw something flicker. Across her face, guilt maybe, or fear of being caught. But then she quickly composed herself, said something to Richard, and started walking back toward me. "I'm sorry," she said when she reached me, her voice appropriately subdued. "Richard was just telling me about some business matters that need to be handled. Your father would have wanted me to stay on top of things." "Business matters," I repeated, flatly. "Yes," Linda said, but she couldn't meet my eyes. "You know how important the company was to your father. Richard and I need to make sure everything continues to run smoothly." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, because I was starting to understand that everything I thought I knew about Linda, about my father's marriage, about my family, was built on lies. As we walked back to the cars, I found myself replaying moments from the past few months, looking for signs I might have missed. Had Linda seemed distant lately? Had she been spending more time away from the house? Had there been phone calls that ended abruptly when I walked into the room? And Richard? Had he been coming around the house more often? Had there been business meetings that seemed to last longer than necessary? Had I been blind to what was happening right in front of me? "Are you riding back to the house with me?" Linda asked as we reached the parking lot. "No," I said. "I think I need some time alone." Linda looked hurt. "Michael, I know this is hard, but we need to stick together. We're all each other has now." "Are we?" I asked, and something in my tone made her step back. "What do you mean?" "I mean, are we really all each other has, or do you have other support systems?" Linda's face went pale. "I don't know what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything," I said. "I'm just wondering how you're managing to cope so well with Dad's death. You seem remarkably resilient." "I'm trying to be strong," Linda said. "For you, for your father's memory. He wouldn't want me to fall apart." "No," I agreed. "He wouldn't. He'd want you to grieve appropriately and then move on with your life. I just didn't realize you'd be moving on quite so quickly." Linda stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her trying to decide how to respond. Finally, she said, "I think you're upset and not thinking clearly. Why don't you come home and we can talk about this?" "I think I'm thinking more clearly than I have in a long time," I said. "And I think I need to do some thinking about what I saw today." As I drove away from the cemetery, leaving Linda standing alone by her car, I realized that my father's death had revealed something I never would have discovered otherwise. The woman I'd called my stepmother for 12 years, the woman I'd trusted and loved and considered family, had been living a lie, and now I had to decide what I was going to do about it. I spent that night in a hotel room, unable to face going back to the house where I'd grown up, where Linda was probably already making plans for her new life with Richard. I kept replaying the scene at the cemetery, trying to convince myself that I'd misinterpreted what I'd seen. Maybe Linda was just seeking comfort from a family friend. Maybe I was reading too much into innocent gestures because I was grieving and not thinking clearly. But deep down, I knew what I'd witnessed. The familiarity between them, the way they'd stood together, the complete absence of appropriate grief in Linda's demeanor. It all pointed to a relationship that had been going on for much longer than the 3 days since my father's death. The next morning, I drove to my father's office at Thompson and Blackwood Construction. I had a key. Dad had given it to me years ago when I'd worked there during college summers. And I wanted to look through his files, his calendar, anything that might give me insight into what had been happening in his life before he died. Tati. Office was quiet on Saturday morning, just the hum of computers and the distant sound of traffic from the street below. My father's office was exactly as he'd left it, his coffee mug still on his desk, his reading glasses folded next to a stack of contracts, a photo of him and Linda from their 10th wedding anniversary prominently displayed on his bookshelf. Started with his calendar, going back through the past 6 months looking for patterns. What I found made my stomach drop. There were dozens of entries for meetings with Richard that had been scheduled during times when I knew Linda was supposed to be at home. There were business dinners that had lasted until late in the evening, and site visits that had taken place on weekends when construction sites would normally be closed. But what really caught my attention were the entries that simply said, L, doctor's appointment, or L, shopping, or L, lunch with friends. These were appointments Linda had apparently made that my father had noted in his calendar, presumably so he'd know where she was. But as I looked at the dates, I realized that many of these appointments coincided with the mysterious meetings with Richard. I pulled out my phone and called Linda's doctor's office, claiming I needed to verify some insurance information for my stepmother. The receptionist was helpful and sympathetic, given that she'd heard about my father's death. "I'm so sorry for your loss," she said. "Your stepmother is such a lovely woman. We haven't seen her in months, though. Her last appointment was back in February. But according to my father's calendar, Linda had had doctor's appointments as recently as last week. I called 2 more places that Linda claimed to frequent: her hair salon and her favorite restaurant where she supposedly had lunch with friends. The salon confirmed that Linda was a regular client, but said her last appointment had been over a month ago. The restaurant had no record of any recent reservations under her name. Linda had been lying to my father about where she was going, and my father had been dutifully noting these lies in his calendar, completely unaware that his wife was deceiving him. I spent the next hour going through my father's desk drawers, looking for anything else that might shed light on the situation. In the bottom drawer, hidden under a stack of old contracts, I found something that made my blood run cold: a private investigator's report. The report was dated just 2 weeks before my father's death, and it was addressed to him personally. As I read through it, I felt sick to my stomach. Subject: Linda Marie Thompson. Investigation period: September 1st, 30. Findings: subject has been observed meeting regularly with Richard Blackwood at various locations, including the Marriott Hotel, downtown, Bella Vista Restaurant, and Blackwood's private residence. Meetings typically occur during daytime hours, when subject has told spouse she is attending other appointments. Physical evidence suggests intimate relationship. Recommend further surveillance if client wishes to pursue divorce proceedings. The CA report included photographs: Linda and Richard entering a hotel together, Linda and Richard kissing in the parking lot of a restaurant, Linda and Richard holding hands as they walked into his house. The dates on the photographs went back months. This wasn't a recent development or a grief-induced mistake. Linda had been having an affair with Richard for at least 6 months, probably longer, but what made it even worse was the final page of the report, which included a note from the private investigator. Client requested termination of surveillance on October 8th. Final payment received. Case closed. October 8th was just 2 days before my father's heart attack. He had discovered Linda's affair, had the proof in his hands, and then he died before he could confront her about it. I sat in my father's chair, holding the evidence of his wife's betrayal, and realized that my father had died knowing that the woman he loved had been cheating on him with his best friend and business partner. The stress of that discovery might have even contributed to his heart attack. My phone buzzed with a text from Linda. "Michael, I'm worried about you. Please come home so we can talk. We need each other right now." I stared at the message, feeling a rage unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Linda was still playing the role of the grieving stepmother, still pretending that we were family, still acting like she cared about me. But she was probably just worried that I suspected something, and wanted to control the narrative. I thought I knew what grief looked like until I saw my stepmother flirting with my father's business partner at his funeral. While I stood at the graveside, tears streaming down my face as they lowered my dad into the ground, Linda was across the cemetery, laughing softly at something Richard Blackwood was whispering in her ear. She had told me just hours before that I was family, that we would get through this loss together. But as I watched her touch Richard's arm and lean into him like a woman who hadn't just buried her husband of 12 years, I realized that everything I thought I knew about my family was a lie. My name is Michael Thompson, and this is the story of how I discovered that the woman who raised me from age 10 wasn't grieving my father's death. She was celebrating her freedom. This is about how Linda, who had played the role of devoted wife and loving stepmother for over a decade, had been planning her exit strategy long before my father's heart attack. And this is about the choice I had to make when I realized that the person I'd trusted most in the world had been lying to me about everything. My father, David Thompson, died on a Tuesday morning in October. He was 58 years old, successful, healthy, and had just returned from his annual physical with a clean bill of health. But at 6:47 a.m., while he was getting dressed for work, he collapsed in his bedroom from a massive heart attack. By the time the paramedics arrived, He was gone. I got the call at my apartment in downtown Chicago, where I worked as a software engineer for a tech startup. Linda's voice was hysterical, barely coherent through her sobs. "Michael, you need to come. Home," she said. "It's your father. He's gone." I drove the 3 hours to my hometown of Springfield in a daze, my mind refusing to process what Linda had told me. My father couldn't be dead. He was too young, too vital, too much of a constant in my life. We'd had dinner just 2 weeks ago, and he'd been talking about his plans for retirement, about the trips he and Linda wanted to take, about how proud he was of the life I'd built for myself. When I arrived at the house where I'd grown up, Linda met me at the door. She looked devastated. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying, her usually perfect hair was disheveled, and she was wearing one of my father's old sweaters like she couldn't bear to be separated from anything that belonged to him. "Oh, Michael," she said, throwing her arms around me. "I'm so glad you're here. I don't know how I'm going to get through this without you." Linda had been my stepmother since I was 10 years old, when she married my father 3 years after my mother died in a car accident. She was beautiful, sophisticated, and 15 years younger than my dad, but she had always been kind to me. She'd never tried to replace my mother, but she'd been a steady, loving presence in my life during some of my most difficult years. "We'll get through it together," I told her, holding her while she cried. "We're family. Dad would want us to take care of each other." "Yes," Linda said, pulling back to look at me with tears in her eyes. "We're family. No matter what happens, we'll always be family." The next few days passed in a blur of funeral arrangements, phone calls, and visits from friends and neighbors offering their condolences. Linda seemed to be holding up well, considering the circumstances. She was organized, gracious with visitors, and determined to give my father the kind of funeral he would have wanted. "Your father was so loved," she said, as we reviewed the guest list for the service. "Look at all these people who want to pay their respects. He touched so many lives." The funeral was scheduled for Friday at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, where my parents had been married and where I'd been confirmed. Linda had chosen all of my father's favorite hymns, arranged for his business partner Richard Blackwood to give a eulogy, and selected a beautiful casket that she said represented the dignity and success my father had achieved in his life. Richard Blackwood had been my father's business partner for over 20 years. Together, they'd built Thompson and Blackwood Construction into one of the most successful contracting companies in central Illinois. Richard was a tall, distinguished man in his early 50s, with silver hair and the kind of easy charm that made him popular at industry events and social gatherings. I'd known Richard my entire life, and he'd always been kind to me. He'd given me summer jobs at the company when I was in high school, had written recommendation letters for my college applications, and had always treated me like a nephew. When my father died, Richard was one of the first people to call and offer his support.